Were those Ukrainian leaders who collaborated actively and politically with the Nazis aware of German policy towards Jews and Ukrainians in the Reich Commissariat, and if so, cannot these leaders rightly be considered war criminals, even in instances where there is no direct evidence of direct participation in genocide? It's addressed, I suppose, to both. Would anyone care to reply?
I suppose the question means whether the people who were in charge of the Central Committee could be described as war criminals. No, I don't think so, personally, because as you look at the situation, you obviously see a number of people who tried, to the best of their ability, to somehow organize the Ukrainian community, which was totally and completely destroyed by the situation as a result of the Soviet occupation and so on. And therefore their notion was that perhaps some kind of a legal structure ought to be established whereby the Ukrainian community has some control over its own affairs. As to the question, now, mind you, this was a very controversial question in the Ukrainian community itself. As I mentioned before, there were people, for example, in the underground who were accusing the leadership of the Ukrainian Central Committee of actually collaborating with the Germans. And on various occasions, and this is documented, all you have to do is just read the underground press. They ripped into them with a great deal of vehemence. As to the question whether he knew what was going on in the Hrycenko-Luhova of Ukraine, obviously they did. The point, however, was in a situation whereby the whole nation finds itself in such a very difficult conditions, perhaps if you can control the events, at least in one part of Ukraine, and that was primarily in Galicia, then perhaps the activities of these people would be justified. You have to remember that after all, as a result of their activities, Ukrainian schools were established. A sort of a normality in the life of the people has been introduced. So here you have two sides to that question. I would go even further and say, because these were primarily the individuals who are responsible for the formation of the division Halichina, that even as late as it was in the war, and perhaps one could even say perhaps it was not a very advisable approach to the question, the formation of the division itself has allowed quite a few Ukrainians to be released from prison. And this was one of the, I suppose, unwritten conditions for the creation of the division. So therefore, it was not totally negative. I should also indicate that behind the formation of the division stood such individuals who are indeed beyond reproach, as for example Metropolitan Sheptytsky. And as we have heard, at the same time he was very strong in his defense of the Jews. He was condemning in the strongest possible terms the involvement of Ukrainians of Ukrainians in the Gestapo activities and so on. Yet he was for the formation of the division. Why? There are speculations of all sorts concerning that matter. For example, at the last conference, Hans Jakob Stelle put forward the proposition that even though Szeptycki was very strongly anti-Nazi, he saw the formation of the division as a possible unit for control of the situation in the event of a total collapse, whereby indeed everybody would be at each other's throat. That's one hypothesis. You could agree or disagree with it. But nevertheless, to condemn all of them simply as war criminals, I think, would be unjustifiable. Concerning Kubiovich himself, I think he has been scrutinized very carefully by various authorities, and I should say he has never been either accused, charged, or put in jail. As a matter of fact, he's quite active to this very day and visits Canada quite often. Even though, as I say, in the last publications emanating from Winnipeg, and I don't know the source of it, but it's a rather interesting publication, he is indeed labeled as a war criminal.
Let me merely add two brief points to what Professor Potichnyj has already said. The first, I simply want to say something slightly more about Volodymyr Kubiovich, and I owe this information to Professor Hunchak, who is in possession of a lengthy memorandum which Kubiovich wrote to Hans Frank, protesting in the strongest terms against the German policies directed against the Ukrainian population, the murder, the Ostarbeiter campaign, all the rest of it. This, coming from a man who had no political status, was an act of very considerable courage. And the other point, which is related, is that I reemphasize the Ukrainian Central Committee had no political role. It is therefore inaccurate to compare it by analogy with to compare Kubiovich and those who helped him with such figures as Laval, Pétain, or Quisling. This was not a civil administration organized by or recognized by the Germans with political status. It was exclusively a committee which was supposed to see to the welfare of the Ukrainian population. I submit that had Kubiovich and his associates not seized this opportunity, the German policies in Galicia might have been far worse than they actually were. Thank you.
Don't go away. Don't go away. Okay. There's a specific question to you, so I'd like to. Professor Yurkevich states that probably the least important reason why Ukrainians found themselves in the auxiliary police would be their sympathy for the Nazi ideology. Yet he states that the younger faction of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists was so taken up with Hitler that they failed to see the distinction between Italian and German fascism. Does that mean that the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists faction of Bandera were excited about the idea of racism and anti-Semitism and supported that aspect of Nazi ideology?
There is a difficulty here with chronology and with the exact understanding of what I said. It is true, of course, that in the 1930s, prior to the outbreak of the war, the younger nationalists were impressed by Hitler's successes in his aggressive foreign policy, his rearmament, the fact that they could count upon him as a militant anti-communist. Racism, however, while certainly not absent, one can find anti-Semitic statements made by these people, was never a central point of their ideology as it was, say, for the Romanian Iron Guard, or as it certainly was for Nazism. It was not for Italian fascism, may I add. Furthermore, the collaboration which the Ukrainian nationalists were prepared to engage in with the Germans hinged upon German recognition of Ukrainian independence. When the Germans made it clear in 1941 that they were not prepared to accept that condition, the Ukrainian nationalists turned against the Germans, and they were the ones, of course, who organized the Ukrainian insurgent army, which fought both the Germans and the Soviets.
I think maybe I should just have both of you stand up here and do a routine. Okay. This question I've tried to combine several together. Could you explain the difference between the German army, Wehrmacht, and the Waffen-SS, as well as the difference between the Waffen-SS and the regular SS? Why did the armed Ukrainian unit not become part of the German army, Wehrmacht, but of the SS? And finally, was the Galician division ever used on the Western Front?
The Wehrmacht was the regular German army. In addition to the German army, as in any totalitarian state, there was a secret police organization. This was the SS. The SS had two branches. There was the General SS, the Allgemeine Schutzstaffel, which which gained power throughout the war, and the longer Hitler remained in power, the more important the SS became, until finally, under Heinrich Himmler, it became really an all-powerful secret police. And this was also the organization which was in charge of the extermination campaign, the extermination of the Jews. After 1940, the SS also began to form armed formations. These were known as the Waffen-SS, the armed SS, and these were more like regular combat forces. Now, the Wehrmacht, as I pointed out, did form Eastern legions without Hitler's knowledge, because Hitler and the top Nazis were, of course, racist. They didn't want to fight with Untermenschen. However, the Waffen-SS, after the defeat at Stalingrad, also became involved in the act, because once the Red Army began advancing, it was crucial to get as many as possible of the local population to serve the Germans as cannon fodder, so that both the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS were involved in this recruitment of Slavs for the German armed forces. As Professor Potichnyj mentioned, a couple of formations from the Ukrainian division were transferred to the Western Front, and they attempted to desert to the French resistance.
In view of the time, this must be the last question, so I'll try and combine them all in one. They are primarily about the auxiliary police and the use of Ukrainians in the death camps. Generally, the questions are, let me just phrase it in this way. How many Ukrainians were incorporated in the auxiliary police, and how many were actually involved in anti-Jewish activity?
It's a question that I have to admit that I can't answer. I have not seen any reliable figures on these. Perhaps Professor Hunchak, from his research in the archives, could give an estimate. We're certainly talking about thousands of people. Yes.
One figure that I saw was 8,000. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. There was a supplementary part to this. In what way was the Ukrainian auxiliary police different from the Jewish auxiliary police, if that's at all accurate?
Well, first of all, the Ukrainian auxiliary police was armed. The Jewish auxiliary police was not armed. They had just the sticks. They also were, even their uniforms were totally different. The Ukrainian auxiliary police, and I think it was done for a purpose, looked like the soldiers of the Ukrainian Legion from 1918. while the Jewish police were actually wearing the hats of the former Polish police. I have, from my own experience, because I have seen the Jews being rounded and transported by the precisely Jewish police to work every morning when I was going to school, for example, they were never armed. But also later on, quite often, you had a German who was armed, either coming at the head or at the end of the column. Sometimes more. And I personally saw my own life, which was a shock to me and continues to be to this day, it stands out in my mind, is that when a man was trying to run for some strange reason from the column, started to run down the street, the German simply picked up a rifle and shot him. And that was the first time that I've seen anybody killed. So it remains with me to this very day. But that is one difference.
I'd like to thank the speakers and remind you that the coffee break is very brief, 15 minutes at the back. And again, I'd like to encourage you to contribute as well. Thank you.